Hello there and welcome to What Makes a Good Leader, presented by the Teaching and Learning Network. My name's Stephen Kolber. My areas of interest are educational research, and in this case I'm applying that to leadership. So the content of this course is basically a summary of the extant research literature on leadership, and throughout the course I'll be presenting you with little activities that you can apply to your school, your staff and yourself, depending on which of those three you're most focused on improving or developing, or how you want to position yourself within a school or the educational system will decide which of those you'll actually follow through on. Okay, so before we get into the more complicated leadership styles, of which there are many and different interpretations and different versions depending on which scholars you read, we're going to start really simply with something that's widely agreed upon and understood, and that is the three forms of leadership work. Okay, in terms of the actual work that leaders do, it can easily be grouped into three different categories. So the first is transformational, second is managerial, and the third is instructional. So these are all work that leaders do. These three things are kind of the core business of being a leader, but each leader and each school will have different focuses on which they lean and lend more towards. So the first and most obvious is just managerial. So this is probably the least studied and the least popular and the least kind of things that people get excited about. There's a lot more research on transformational and instructional leadership and the work that involves, but managerial is basically the backbone or the spine of any organization. So the work of a manager as opposed to a leader, but of course managerialism is part of leadership, is basically all the things you would imagine. Structuring things, developing timelines, developing the dates to fit within those timelines, making sure they don't clash, managing student behavior, managing student attendance. Basically, managerialism is involved with the data, the time, and the sequencing of everything that occurs, and also kind of the nitty-gritty things of, filling in forms, signing documents, paperwork, administration. All those sort of core tasks are the managerial work of a leader. So the key question for this type of leadership work, for managerialism or managerial leadership work, is: what are you managing and does it matter? So those are kind of the two core questions. Even if you had two leaders that were both managerial by design or by implementation, or the way that they worked was typically very managerial, the things that they focused on would still be dramatically different. And each of these leaders would have a different opinion of what's important and what's worth actually managing and what's worth not managing, and how you break that down within your leadership structure as to who is managing what and when and why. Okay, the second is the most popular. So this is what we call instructional leadership, and the work of an instructional leader is basically providing exemplars, providing research that relates to good instruction. In an ideal sense, it'd be writing curriculum, developing assessment, and actually getting down knee-deep in the nitty-gritty of what actually happens in a school, which is of course teaching and learning. So the interest in instructional leadership has sort of waxed and waned throughout the years, but over probably the last 15 or 25 years, this has been the most popular and the most commonly studied form of instructional leadership, of leadership overall rather. And so we'll go through a little bit more detail about this, and it will get a further expansion within the leadership styles, because this is probably considered kind of the gold standard and what people are aiming for. But as you'll see throughout the course, it's very rarely realized in actual leadership practices. And the key question for this is: what is your vision of best practice and how can you communicate that to staff? So the third form is transformational leadership, and this is basically involved with people. So the thing that you are transforming in the phrase transformational leadership is your staff and also the students within it, but you typically lead through your staff, so you're transforming your staff so that you can transform your students. Vivian Robinson's written a book entitled Student-Centered Leadership that sort of has this in mind, but still typically the focus of transformational leadership is developing your staff and your leaders, especially your middle leaders, and developing all staff's expertise as learners and as professionals. So of the three, transformational is probably the most roundabout. So the key question is actually, who are you developing and what are they developing? So it adds in another layer of complexity in between the two. So you're developing teachers or leaders, or let's start from the top, you're developing leaders so they can develop teachers, so the teachers can develop effective students. So it's a very human and relational thing, and it basically is hinged mostly on relationships and the knowledge that you have of your staff, of your context, and of your specific setting. Okay, so those are the three actual main forms of work that leaders actually do within a school. And so what I want you to think now, keeping in mind the Venn diagram structure that we've set out, is keeping those all leaders will do all three regardless of which they prefer or what preference they have. This is not really a style thing. It's sort of this is work that needs to be done within a school, and it's just a question of who is doing it and how you divide up the duties based on that. So keeping in mind our activity about school, staff and self, what I want you to do is either download the form or sketch out your own little Venn diagram depending on what device or how you're watching this or listening to this, and position firstly your school, so your school style preference, so probably starting with the principal at the top. Put a little dot where you think your primary leader, the principal, it would position themselves within these three forms of work. And then thinking of your school, obviously if you're watching this, you're either looking to develop yourself as a leader, become a leader, or change the leadership position that you currently have. So it'd be worth looking at an organizational structural chart of your school or sketching one out by yourself and sort of grouping where each of the staff or the leadership roles, where they position themselves between these three quadrants. So for the school level, this might seem like an obvious thing in that, obviously learning specialists, for example, are instructional leadership, and your kind of student managers are transformational, for example. But each school will have its own different sort of picadillos in the way that they do things differently. So it's really worth taking the time to plot each of the positions and maybe even going into a more granular detail level and adding in each of the actual people that are within your leadership structure of your school and where they position themselves. And then lastly, and perhaps the easiest, we're at the self stage. So I would suggest that everyone would take the time to do this themselves, at least draw up the Venn diagram and position themselves based on either the work that they're doing or the work that they intend to do or the roles that they intend to apply to do, where they would position themselves in between these three quadrants. And you'll tend to be towards 2 at the expense of 1, but obviously that's a reflective practice for you. Place yourself where you are and perhaps think about where you want to be to achieve the positions that you're actually applying for based on the charting and the sort of placements that you've done based on your leadership structure in your school. Okay, so that summarizes sort of the work of a leader, and it gives us 3 frames of reference at a most basic level to think about teachers and leaders and how they might position themselves within the structure. Obviously, what's next is a more complicated breakdown of leadership styles that will give you a much better idea of your identity and your personality as a leader. All of this research that has been summarized for you comes from Hallinger 1992, and that'll be available in the further reading tab if you would like to read more.